In the quiet, picturesque town of Brooksville, nestled within the verdant hills of Vermont, Mark Reynolds was known as a competent but unremarkable lawyer. His days were spent handling mundane legal matters for the town's modest population. That was until an anonymous tip landed on his desk, wrapped in an unmarked envelope, changing his life forever. The envelope contained documents pointing to a local pharmaceutical company, Novogen, which was implicated in a series of deaths linked to their newly developed medication, Perzine. The documents suggested that the company had knowingly concealed adverse effects that led to several fatalities. Mark, who had always been a stickler for justice, felt an unsettling chill as he read through the damning evidence. These were not just cases of unfortunate side effects, there were indications of a cover-up at the highest levels of the company. As Mark dug deeper, the name of a key witness surfaced, Ellen Pierce, a former employee of Novogen. Ellen had worked as a lab technician and had noticed discrepancies in the test results related to Perzine's safety trials. She had tried to bring these issues to the attention of her supervisors but was promptly silenced with a hefty severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. Mark reached out to Ellen, who was understandably fearful but agreed to meet. In a secluded corner of a coffee shop, Ellen recounted her story, her voice barely a whisper. She spoke of altered lab reports and the disposal of incriminating documents. The executives had been aware of the risks but proceeded with the drug release, prioritizing profits over safety. Buoyed by Ellen's testimony, Mark felt a surge of determination. However, his resolve was tested when Ellen was found dead in her apartment the following day. The cause of death was ruled as an overdose, but Mark suspected foul play, especially since Ellen had confessed to being a teetotaler who rarely took medication. Shaken but undeterred, Mark decided to confront Novogen directly. He arranged a meeting with their legal team, a group of sharp-dressed, seasoned attorneys led by the formidable Madeline Graves. The meeting was tense, with Madeline dismissing his claims and presenting counterarguments that painted Mark as a misguided small-town lawyer out of his depth. She subtly hinted at the potential repercussions of pursuing this case, mentioning Mark's budding career and the impact on his family. The threat was clear: drop the case or face the consequences. As Mark left the corporate office, he noticed a black SUV following him. His heart raced as he drove through the town's winding roads, eventually shaking off his tail. That night, as he reviewed his notes, the phone rang. It was an anonymous caller, warning him to stop digging, or else. The voice was calm, almost friendly, but the underlying menace was palpable. Feeling the walls closing in, Mark knew he was at a crossroads. He could abandon the case, keep his family safe, and continue his quiet life in Brooksville. Or he could risk everything to bring Novogen to justice. The moral dilemma gnawed at him. His wife, Sarah, noticed his distress and pressed him to confide in her. Mark hesitated, knowing the danger that might spill over to his loved ones. Late into the night, Mark sat alone in his office, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He sifted through the documents again, each page a reminder of the lives lost and the potential future victims if Novogen's practices continued unchecked. The stakes were higher than ever, and Mark felt the burden of choosing between his moral duty and personal safety. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the papers strewn across his desk. Mark took a deep breath, his mind made up. He would not be bullied into silence. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of a journalist he knew could help bring this story to light. As the phone rang, Mark steeled himself for the battle ahead, unaware of just how deep the conspiracy went or the dangers lurking in the shadows. The following morning, Mark met with David Trent, an investigative journalist from the Brooksville Herald. David was known for his relentless pursuit of the truth, regardless of the risks involved. Mark presented the evidence to him, detailing the potential cover-up by Novogen and Ellen Pierce's mysterious death. David listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "We have to be careful," David warned, his brow furrowing as he examined the documents. "If what you're saying is true, we're dealing with people who won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets in their way." As they discussed the next steps, a waitress approached their table with a fresh pot of coffee. Mark noticed her glancing at the papers spread before them, her eyes lingering a moment too long. After she left, Mark's paranoia flared up. "Do you think she could be one of them?" he whispered, leaning in closer to David. David shrugged, though his eyes darted around the diner, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. "Let's not jump to conclusions. But we should definitely keep a low profile." As they parted ways, Mark felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. He knew he had crossed a line, there was no turning back now. That evening, as he prepared dinner, he noticed Sarah was unusually quiet. When he asked what was wrong, she hesitated before speaking. "There's been a car parked across the street all day," she said, her voice tinged with anxiety. "I think we're being watched." Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He glanced out the window, seeing the same black SUV from the day before. The driver was invisible behind tinted windows, but the message was clear. He pulled Sarah into a tight embrace, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. The next day, Mark received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was deep and unfamiliar. "Mr. Reynolds, you're making a mistake. You still have a chance to walk away." Before Mark could respond, the line went dead. He felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He immediately contacted David, who agreed they needed to move quickly. David promised to expedite the story, hoping to publish it by the end of the week. David was silent for a moment before replying, "I've got a safe house arranged. It's a bit out of town, but you'll be secure there. I'll send you the details." As Mark hung up, he felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He turned to Sarah, who looked exhausted but relieved. "We're doing the right thing," he reassured her, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing her or himself. The next morning, they made their way to the safe house, an isolated cabin nestled in the woods. David had arranged for a security detail to guard them. Mark felt a temporary sense of relief, but the fear never fully dissipated. As they settled in, David arrived with his equipment, ready to finalize the article. "Once this goes public, there's no going back," David reminded Mark. "Novagen will throw everything they have at us. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Mark nodded, though the fear in his gut made him hesitate. "We have to do this. For Ellen, for the victims, for everyone they've silenced." As they worked, a sense of urgency filled the room. The story was set to publish the next morning, with copies sent to multiple news outlets to prevent any suppression attempts. David and Mark recorded a video statement, explaining the evidence and urging authorities to investigate further. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the dark woods outside, every rustle of leaves setting his nerves on edge. He knew they were exposed, vulnerable to Novagen's reach. But he also knew that they were on the brink of exposing a monstrous injustice. The tension was unbearable, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Just before dawn, Mark received a call from David. "It's done. The stories live." Mark felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. "What happens now?" "We wait," David replied. "And hope the truth is enough to protect us." Mark hung up and sat in silence, staring into the darkness. He knew the storm was coming. The only question was whether they could weather it. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Mark prepared himself for the inevitable fallout, knowing that their lives would never be the same. As the story broke, it spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up on the scandal, splashing the headline, "Pharma Giant Novagen Implicated in Fatal Cover-Up," across every major channel and newspaper. The public reaction was immediate and intense, with calls for investigations and accountability flooding social media and government offices. Mark watched from the safety of the cabin as the media storm unfolded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. David Trent, who had taken a more visible role in the aftermath, became the public face of the exposé. He appeared on news programs, discussing the details of the story and the dangers they faced. Meanwhile, Mark and his family remained hidden, knowing that their safety was still precarious. Despite the widespread coverage and public outrage, Mark felt uneasy. Novagen was a powerful corporation with deep ties in both the corporate and political spheres. He knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. His fears were soon confirmed when David called with troubling news. "Mark, I've been hearing rumors. There's talk that Novagen might be planning to discredit us, to make it look like we fabricated the evidence." Mark's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "There are whispers of forged documents and paid witnesses. They're going to try and flip the narrative, make us the villains." Mark felt a surge of anger and fear. The implications were terrifying. If Novagen succeeded, they could not only ruin their reputations but also put them in legal jeopardy. He immediately contacted his lawyer, a seasoned attorney named Jack Connors, to discuss the potential fallout. As Mark spoke with Jack, the true scope of the danger became clear. "Mark, we need to be prepared for anything," Jack warned. "They could come after you for defamation, slander, anything to tarnish your credibility." In the days that followed, Mark felt the noose tightening. Reporters started digging into his past, looking for any dirt that could discredit him. A smear campaign began to surface, with anonymous sources claiming Mark had a vendetta against Novagen, alleging he had been fired from a previous job for unethical behavior. Mark knew these were lies, but the damage was already being done. David, too, faced scrutiny, with accusations of unethical journalism practices. The pressure was immense, and Mark found himself questioning whether they had done the right thing. The strain on his family was palpable. Sarah was constantly worried, and their children, sensing the tension, became anxious and withdrawn. One evening, as Mark sat in the living room of the cabin, Sarah approached him with a concerned look. "Mark, maybe we should consider taking a deal if they offer one," she suggested, her voice trembling. "This is tearing us apart." Mark shook his head. "We can't back down now, Sarah. If we do, they win. They'll keep getting away with it." Sarah sighed, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm scared, Mark. For you, for the kids. I just want this to be over." Mark hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "I know, and I'm scared too. But we have to believe that the truth will come out." That night, Mark received an unexpected visitor, a private investigator named Robert Cole, who claimed to have crucial information. Mark was wary but agreed to meet him outside the cabin under the watchful eyes of their security detail. Cole, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, wasted no time. "I've been following this case closely," he said. "And I've found something you need to see." He handed Mark a folder. Inside were photos and documents showing Novagen executives meeting with known criminal figures, as well as a bank statement suggesting bribes had been paid to silence witnesses. Mark's eyes widened as he flipped through the evidence. "Where did you get this?" Cole smirked. "Let's just say I have my sources. But you need to be careful. They know I have this, and they won't hesitate to come after you." Mark thanked Cole and hurried back inside, showing the documents to Sarah and David, who had arrived earlier. David's face lit up with excitement. "This could be the smoking gun we need," he said, but his tone quickly turned serious. "We need to get this out, but we have to be smart about it. If they know we have this, they'll stop at nothing to bury it." The group debated their next steps, eventually deciding to pass the information to a trusted journalist at a national news network. The hope was that by widening the exposure, they could protect themselves and ensure the story couldn't be easily silenced. As the new revelations hit the airwaves, the backlash against Novagen intensified. Calls for a full-scale investigation grew louder, and several high-ranking officials began distancing themselves from the company. But the threat to Mark and his family didn't dissipate. One night, the cabin's security alarms went off, sending everyone into a panic. The guards reported seeing a figure fleeing into the woods, but they couldn't identify who it was or if it posed a real threat. The incident left Mark rattled. The stress was taking its toll, and he was constantly on edge, fearing for his family's safety. Despite the growing public support, he felt isolated, trapped in a battle that seemed to have no end in sight. Then, a surprising twist occurred. A former Novagen executive, who had fled the country when the scandal broke, contacted David through an intermediary. The executive, named Arthur Hall, was willing to testify against the company in exchange for immunity. He had been part of the core team that orchestrated the cover-up and had detailed knowledge of the bribery and threats used to keep the scandal under wraps. Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Hall's testimony could be the final nail in Novagen's coffin. They arranged for Hall to be interviewed by the authorities, ensuring his safety through a secure, undisclosed location. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and the anticipation was palpable. As they waited for the day to arrive, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The threats, the constant surveillance, and the attempted break-in all pointed to a desperate corporation on the brink of collapse. He knew they had to stay vigilant, for Novagen would not go down quietly. The night before the interview, Mark received a cryptic message on his phone: "You can't hide forever." The message sent chills down his spine. He showed it to David and the security team, who took it seriously and increased their vigilance. The next morning, as Mark prepared for what could be the most important day of his life, he felt a strange mix of dread and determination. He knew the risks they were taking, but the possibility of finally seeing justice kept him moving forward. The truth was so close, yet the dangers loomed larger than ever. As the clock ticked towards the interview, Mark steeled himself for whatever came next, knowing that the final showdown was just around the corner. The day of Arthur Hall's interview dawned with an air of tense anticipation. The safe house where Mark, Sarah, and their children were staying buzzed with activity as security teams ensured every precaution was in place. Mark and David reviewed the final details with Hall's lawyer over a secure video call, ironing out the last-minute logistics. Hall, appearing nervous but resolute, confirmed he would provide the crucial testimony to expose Novagen's malpractices. As the hour of the interview approached, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something monumental. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the guards outside and the hushed conversations within. The weather had turned ominously gray, a thick fog settling over the woods, amplifying the tension. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the ringing of Mark's phone. The number was unknown. He hesitated before answering, feeling a cold dread seep into his bones. "Mr. Reynolds," the voice on the other end was deep, calm, and chillingly familiar. "You've made quite the spectacle, haven't you?" Mark's grip tightened around the phone. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled softly. That's not important. What matters is that you stop what you're doing. You and your family will pay if you don't. Mark felt his heart rate spike. Is that a threat? It's a warning, the voice corrected. Last chance, Mr. Reynolds. Walk away. The line went dead. Mark stared at the phone, his mind racing. He quickly relayed the call to David and the security team, who immediately began scanning for any unusual activity. Mark knew they were running out of time, the walls were closing in, and Novigen's desperation was palpable. As Hall's interview began, broadcast securely to multiple undisclosed locations, Mark and David watched from the cabin. Hall detailed the internal corruption at Novigen, describing secret meetings where executives plotted to suppress the negative data on Prozine. He provided documents, corroborating his testimony with emails and recorded conversations. It was damning evidence, leaving no doubt about the company's culpability. Just as Hall finished his testimony, chaos erupted outside the cabin. The security team's radios crackled with frantic chatter. Mark ran to the window, seeing figures moving swiftly through the fog. He heard a crash from the front door, followed by shouts. The cabin was under attack. Mark quickly ushered Sarah and the children into a hidden basement room, locking the door behind them. He grabbed a small handgun from a drawer, his hands shaking. He could hear the muffled sounds of struggle and shouting above. His mind raced with the possibility of losing everything in these final moments. Suddenly, the door to the basement burst open, and a masked figure lunged at Mark. He fired a shot, missing wide, and was tackled to the ground. As they struggled, Mark felt a sharp pain as the assailant struck him in the side with something hard. His vision blurred, and he heard Sarah screaming his name. The next moments were a blur. Mark fought desperately, managing to land a few blows before another figure dragged him off. He was thrown against the wall, gasping for breath, as the first attacker advanced, holding a knife. Just as the assailant lunged, a shot rang out, and the attacker collapsed. Mark turned to see David, holding the gun with shaking hands, his face pale. Before they could react, the remaining assailants fled, leaving chaos in their wake. The security team quickly took control, assessing the situation and ensuring the family's safety. Mark, bleeding but conscious, was helped to a chair. He looked at Sarah and the children, huddled together, eyes wide with fear. The authorities arrived soon after, taking statements and securing the area. The media, already frenzied over Hall's testimony, descended on the story of the attack, amplifying the scandal surrounding Novigen. The company issued a statement denying any involvement, but the public wasn't buying it. The evidence was too overwhelming, the narrative too compelling. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and severe. Novigen's stock plummeted, and its CEO was forced to resign. Multiple arrests were made, including high-ranking executives implicated in the conspiracy. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, unearthing further evidence of corruption and illegal activities. The case became a landmark example of corporate malfeasance, with Mark hailed as a hero for his bravery. But the victory was bittersweet. Mark and his family had to be relocated under witness protection due to ongoing threats. The experience left them scarred, constantly looking over their shoulders, wary of a world that had shown its darker side. David continued his journalism, but with a renewed sense of caution, aware of the price of truth. Despite the hardships, Mark found solace in knowing they had made a difference. They had exposed a monstrous injustice and brought about significant change. The victims of Prozine received justice, and new regulations were put in place to prevent similar tragedies. Yet, the ordeal had changed him, leaving a lingering shadow over his once simple life. As they settled into their new home, Mark reflected on the journey. It had been a harrowing experience, fraught with danger and moral dilemmas. But through it all, he had held on to his principles, even when it meant risking everything. He looked at his family, knowing they had survived not just the conspiracy but the fallout of their own actions. They had chosen to fight for what was right, and though the cost had been high, it had been worth it. In the end, the truth had prevailed, and justice had been served. But Mark knew that the shadows of Brooksville, the whispers of conspiracy, would always linger in his mind, a reminder of the price of truth and the courage it took to confront it.